If you're 55 or older and you still don't have a real retirement plan, I need you to hear this before you close this video. 8 years ago, I opened my banking app and saw $7,200. That was it. 22 years of work, and $7,200 was the number staring back at me. I'm not giving you theory today. I'm giving you the 8 years compressed. Every mistake that cost me money, every rule that changed my trajectory, every number that actually mattered. 30 minutes. That's the promise. By the end, you'll know exactly what I know now. The version of this I wish someone had handed me at 47. I didn't have that person, so today, I'm going to be that person for you. But first, you need to understand exactly how bad it got before it got better. You want to know how bad it got. I mean really got. Not the version I tell at dinner parties, not the cleaned up version. The actual version. I share this kind of thing every week on this channel. The real numbers, not the highlight reel. So if that's useful to you, it might be worth hitting subscribe before we go further. Okay. Here's what nobody tells you about panic. Panic doesn't feel like panic when you're inside it. It feels like action. It feels like you're finally doing something. 3 weeks after I saw that $7,200 number, a guy I worked with, good salesman, terrible with money, just like me, wouldn't stop talking about crypto. Every lunch break, every slow afternoon on the sales floor, he had charts on his phone. He had a strategy. He was up 40% in a month, or so he said. So I did what a scared, desperate man does. I opened an account. I put money in. Real money. Money I didn't have room to lose. I won't bore you with the coin names. It doesn't matter. What matters is the number. I was down before the week was out, and I kept adding more, chasing the number back up, the way you chase a slot machine that already took your rent money. Then I decided crypto was too slow. I know how that sounds. Stay with me. I started day trading. Actual stocks, actual market hours, actual sitting in front of a screen at 9:29 a.m. with my coffee going cold, convinced that this, finally, was going to be the thing that fixed everything. 21 days. That's how long I lasted. 21 days and I was down $3,400. Not from one bad trade, from 100 small ones. From fees, from panic selling at the bottom and panic buying at the top. From treating my retirement money like it was a video game with a respawn button. There is no respawn button. I want you to really hear that because it's the thing nobody says out loud. At 47, there's no do-over round. The clock doesn't reset. But I wasn't done making mistakes yet. Not even close. Somewhere in there, humiliated, still down money, still without a plan, I found a guy online. Slick video. Nice watch. Promised me a system. $800 for a course that I found out later was mostly things you could learn for free in an afternoon if you knew where to look. I bought it anyway. Because at that point I wasn't thinking like a sales rep who'd spent 22 years reading people. I was thinking like a man who wanted someone, anyone, to just tell him it was going to be okay. Add it up. Go ahead, do the math with me because the number matters more than the story around it. 3,400 from day trading, 800 from the course. A few hundred more bleeding out of that crypto account before I finally closed it for good. $4,200. Gone. On top of the $7,200 I already didn't have enough of. I sat with that number for a long time, not doing anything. Just sitting with it the way you sit with a diagnosis before you decide what to do about it. And that's the part of this story most people skip. They skip the sitting, they skip the quiet. They jump straight from rock bottom to, here's my success, like there wasn't a long, boring, unglamorous middle where nothing was happening yet. Something was happening, though. I just couldn't see it yet. Because 3 months into that silence, I stumbled onto a number that had been sitting in the tax code the entire time, waiting for someone my age to notice it. I want to tell you something else about that $4,200, because the number itself isn't really the point. The point is what it revealed about how I was thinking. I wasn't investing, I was gambling with a retirement costume on. Same behavior, chasing a number, refreshing an app, feeling my stomach drop every time it moved the wrong way, just dressed up in language that made it sound responsible. Portfolio, position, strategy, words that made panic sound like planning. Here's the part that still bothers me looking back. I'd spent 22 years as a salesman. My entire career was built on reading people, knowing when someone was nervous, when someone was overselling, when a deal sounded too smooth to be real. And I completely missed every single one of those signals when I was the one being sold to. That guy with the crypto charts on the sales floor. That online course with the slick production and the countdown timer telling me the offer expired in 6 hours. I would have clocked those tactics instantly if a customer had used them on me. I didn't clock them when they were aimed at my own fear. That's not a confession I make lightly. I still feel a little embarrassed saying it out loud, even now, even years later, even with the numbers finally moving the right direction. But I made a decision early on that this channel wasn't going to be the polished version. If I only ever showed you the wins, I'd just be one more guy with rented confidence, and you'd have every right not to trust a word I said. So here's the actual number, one more time, so it sits with you the way it sat with me. $4,200 in a little under 2 months, on top of a starting point that was already $7,200 short of where 22 years of work should have left me. I didn't have room for that loss, not even close. And for a while, I genuinely wondered if I'd made things permanently worse by trying to fix them fast. I hadn't. But I didn't know that yet, sitting in the quiet after I finally stopped moving money around out of fear. And that number is where this whole thing actually starts. A number that had been sitting in the tax code the whole time. Let that sink in for a second. Not a new law. Not some loophole a hedge fund manager whispered into a senator's ear last year. This thing had existed for over a decade. It was just never mentioned to me. Not by my bank, not by HR, not by a single one of my coworkers, and I worked alongside the same 40 people for over a decade. Here's what I found, sitting at my kitchen table on a Tuesday night, half expecting to find nothing. Once you turn 50, the IRS lets you put more into your 401k than everyone younger than you. Thousands more every single year on top of the normal limit. They call it a catch-up contribution, and the name is almost too honest. It's the government, of all things, admitting that some of us are going to need to catch up. At the time, that meant an extra $7,500 a year into my 401k, just for having lived long enough to turn 50. And on top of that, another $1,000 a year I could push into a Roth IRA that younger workers weren't allowed to touch. I read it 3 times. I thought there had to be a catch. There wasn't. There was just nobody talking about it. Has this happened to you? A rule, a benefit, something built specifically to help people our age, and you only found out about it by accident, years after you could have been using it? Tell me in the comments. I want to know how many of us are finding this stuff late, because I wasn't the only one finding things late. That's the part of this I think about more than almost anything else. There was a guy at work, I'll call him Howard, younger than me by about 3 years, sharper than me with numbers, the kind of guy who could do the math in his head before I'd finish pulling out my phone calculator. Howard used to tease me gently about how disorganized I was with money. Fair. He wasn't wrong. But Howard had a blind spot too. He assumed the retirement rules he'd learned at 30 still applied at 52. He never went looking for what had changed because in his mind, nothing needed to change. He was fine. He said that word a lot. Fine. I showed him the catch-up numbers on my phone one afternoon in the break room. He looked at them the way you look at a text from an old friend you'd lost touch with. A little stunned that something so useful had just been sitting there unclaimed. Fine isn't the same as on track. I didn't say that to him. I wish I had. I started running the actual math, not vague, hopeful math. Real math, on a spreadsheet I built myself because I didn't trust anyone else's calculator to tell me the truth I actually needed to hear. If I maxed that catch-up contribution every single year from 50 to 55, 5 years, and the market did anything close to what it's historically done, I wasn't just adding $7,500 a year. I was adding $7,500 a year that then had years to grow, compounding quietly in the background while I slept, while I worked, while I lived my regular, unremarkable Tuesday-Thursday life. That's the part people miss about catch-up contributions. It's not just the extra money going in. It's that even a late dollar still gets years to compound if you actually use the years you have left. 5 years isn't nothing. 5 years is enough to change the entire shape of the outcome if you stop wasting it on panic and start pointing it at something real. I want to be honest with you about something, though, because I promised you the real version of this, not the polished one. Catch-up contributions alone didn't save me. I need you to understand that, because if you're sitting there thinking, okay, I'll just do that one thing and I'm set, I'd be lying to you if I let you believe that. It was the first domino, not the whole chain. I checked in with Howard again about 6 months later. Different break room conversation, different tone entirely. He'd opened an account, started contributing, run his own version of the spreadsheet math I'd shown him. He wasn't thanking me exactly. Howard wasn't really the thanking type, but he'd stopped saying fine. That was the tell. He'd started saying getting there instead, which is a very different sentence, even if it sounds almost the same. I bring up Howard because I think a lot of us have a version of him in our lives. Somebody who seems like they've got it together. Somebody whose confidence you've quietly measured yourself against, usually unfavorably. And more often than you'd think, that confidence is just untested. It's not wrong on purpose. It's just never been checked against the actual numbers, because checking feels unnecessary when everything still feels fine. I want to be specific about why the catch-up rule matters so much at our age, because extra money allowed in undersells it. It's not just permission. It's a correction built into the system on purpose for exactly the demographic watching this video right now. The ones who had a late wake-up call, a divorce, a layoff, a business that didn't pan out, whatever your version of my $7,200 moment was. Congress didn't build that provision for 25-year-olds. They built it for us. And once I understood that it existed specifically for people in my position, something shifted in how I felt about the whole situation. I stopped feeling like I was permanently behind a race that had already been decided. I started feeling like there was a lane built for exactly this, narrower than I would have liked, later than I would have liked, but real. Actually usable. Not a metaphor. A specific set of numbers I could put into a specific account starting that same week. The next domino is the one most people my age get completely wrong, and it cost me almost a full year of confusion before I understood it. Almost a full year of confusion. I want you to sit with that number for a second because it's not a small one. A full year at 51 when I genuinely did not have a year to waste. Nobody at 51 has a spare year lying around. And I burned one on something that, looking back, should have taken me an afternoon to figure out. Here's what happened. Once I started actually contributing real money, the catch-up amounts, consistent paycheck after paycheck, I made the second mistake almost nobody warns you about. I assumed that putting the money in was the hard part. I thought once it was in the account, it was basically handled. It was not handled. I had money sitting in whatever the default fund was inside my old 401k. I'd never once looked at what that fund actually was, never checked the fees, never asked a single question about it in 22 years of contributing to it, on and off. But before I show you what I found, I want you to think about your own accounts for a second. Not mine, yours. When's the last time you actually opened one up and really looked, at what you're paying to hold your own money? Because here's what I found when I finally did. My old default fund was charging just over 1% a year in fees. 1% doesn't sound like much. It sounds like nothing, honestly. It sounds like the kind of number you'd skip right past on a statement. It is not nothing. 1% a year compounding against you instead of for you over 20 or 30 years can quietly eat a genuinely staggering chunk of your total retirement balance. We're not talking a few $1,000s. Depending on your balance and your timeline, that 1% can cost you tens of thousands of dollars over a full working lifetime, money that just evaporates into someone else's revenue silently while your statement still shows a number going up and makes you feel like everything's fine. I moved almost everything into low-cost index funds, funds charging a few hundredths of a percent instead of a full percent or more. Same basic exposure to the market, a fraction of the cost. I'm not going to pretend this was some genius insight I arrived at alone. I read it in one of those 4 books I mentioned earlier, the ones I finally sat down and read after I stopped bleeding money into crypto and day trading. It's not complicated information, it's just information nobody hands you. That's the pattern I want you to notice, by the way, because it's the same pattern every single time. It wasn't that the good information was hidden in some vault. It was sitting right there in plain language in books that cost $15. The only thing standing between me and it was that I'd never once gone looking. I built the habit after that. Every year I'd sit down for one afternoon, just one, and actually look. What am I paying in fees? What's my allocation actually doing? Am I still on track for the number I need, or has something quietly drifted? That one afternoon a year became the single highest return hour of my entire financial life. Not the catch-up contributions, not any specific fund. That one habit of actually looking. I'm not saying fees are the whole story, they're not. But they were domino number 2, and once that one fell, it made every domino after it easier to see clearly. Let me put that 1% in a slightly different frame because the raw percentage doesn't always land the way the actual dollars do. Picture 2 identical accounts, same starting balance, same contributions every year, same exact market returns. The only difference is one of them pays a full percent in fees every year, and the other pays a fraction of that. Run that difference out over 25 or 30 years, and the low-fee account doesn't just end up a little ahead. It can end up tens of thousands of dollars ahead, sometimes far more depending on the balance, without either account taking on a single ounce of extra risk. Same market, same luck. Same everything, except what quietly got skimmed off the top every single year. That's the part that made me genuinely angry when I first understood it. Not at any one person. Nobody sat me down and lied to me. It was more that the entire system is set up so that the default option is rarely the cheapest option, and unless you go looking, you'll never know the difference because your statement still shows the number climbing. Climbing slower than it should, but climbing. Just enough to keep you from asking questions. I started asking questions after that. About everything. What am I actually invested in? What is this specific fund charging me? Is there a version of the same basic exposure that costs less? It sounds tedious, and I won't pretend it isn't, a little. But it's the kind of tedious that pays better than almost anything else I did in this entire 8-year stretch, dollar for dollar, hour for hour. I've had people ask me if this means they should panic and move everything around overnight. No. That's not what I'm telling you. I'm telling you to look. Just look. One afternoon. That's genuinely all it takes to know whether you're one of the lucky ones already in low-cost funds, or whether you're quietly losing tens of thousands of dollars to a default setting nobody ever explained to you. Because the third domino, the one that changed how I thought about the actual date I'd retire, not just the account I'd retire with, was the one that surprised me the most. Surprised me the most because for over 2 years, I had a retirement age picked out that I'd never actually done any math to arrive at. 65. I just knew it was 65. The way you know your own birthday. Nobody taught it to me. It was just floating in the culture somewhere. A number I'd absorbed from my father, from old commercials, from decades of hearing 65 attached to the word retirement like they were permanently welded together. I want to be honest with you. Some of what I'm about to say isn't going to apply to everyone watching this. If you're already sitting on a solid nest egg, if you started saving at 25 instead of 47, the urgency I'm about to describe is going to hit you differently, and that's fine. This next part is really for the people like me, the ones doing catch-up math, not cruise control math. Here's the thing that broke my brain a little when I actually sat down and ran it. Your retirement date isn't a feeling. It's not a milestone birthday. It's math, and the math cares about something almost nobody talks about. What the market happens to be doing in the first few years after you stop working. It's called sequence of returns risk, and it sounds technical, so let me make it simple. Imagine 2 people, same amount saved, same withdrawal rate, retiring at the exact same age. One of them retires right before a strong market run. The other retires right before a rough 2 or 3 years. Same starting number. Same plan on paper. The person who hits a downturn early, pulling money out of a shrinking account instead of a growing one, can run out of money years, sometimes over a decade, before the person who got lucky with timing, even though they started with the same amount and spent the same way. The order the returns show up in matters almost as much as the returns themselves. That terrified me the first time I understood it, honestly, because it meant I couldn't just pick 65 out of the air like a birthday and call it a plan. I had to think about buffers, about having a few years of safer, more stable money set aside for exactly the moment I'd need to start withdrawing. So if the market decided to have a bad couple of years right when I retired, I wouldn't be forced to sell shrinking investments just to eat. That one shift, building what amounts to a shock absorber for the first few years of retirement, is something almost nobody my age had ever mentioned to me. Not my bank, not a single coworker. I found it again in a book, sitting quietly in a chapter I almost skipped. I stopped thinking about my retirement date as a single number on a calendar. I started thinking about it as a range, a window, something that shifts depending on what the market's actually doing when I get close. That flexibility, more than any single account or contribution, is what let me stop white-knuckling this whole process. I sleep through the night now. I mentioned that earlier, and I meant it literally. Not because the number in my account is huge, it isn't, not yet, but because I finally understand the shape of the plan well enough to trust it, even on the nights the market does something ugly. Let me give you a concrete picture of what that buffer actually looks like, because shock absorber can sound abstract until you see the shape of it. Instead of keeping everything in the market, growing and shrinking with every headline, I started setting aside roughly 2 to 3 years of expected living costs in something far more stable, not chasing growth with that particular slice, just protecting it. The rest stays invested, doing what invested money is supposed to do over the long run. But that buffer means if the market drops hard the year I actually retire, I'm not forced to sell shares at the worst possible moment just to cover groceries and a mortgage payment. I can live off the stable slice, let the invested portion recover on its own timeline, and refill the buffer later once things settle. It's a simple idea. It is not a complicated strategy, and I want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes financial content makes things sound more complicated than they need to be, so it feels more valuable. This isn't complicated. It's just something nobody had ever explained to me in plain language. In the context of my actual age and my actual timeline, I also had to unlearn something my father believed, and his father before him probably. This idea that retirement is a single door you walk through on one specific day, and before that day you're working, and after that day you're retired, clean and permanent. That's not really how it works anymore for most people, and it's definitely not how it worked for me. I've thought about scaling back gradually. Fewer hours than none. A range instead of a hard line. That flexibility itself is a kind of protection, one more buffer layered on top of the financial one. But understanding the shape of the plan is one thing. There's a fourth piece, the one connected to Social Security, that I got completely backwards for almost 3 years, and getting it backwards nearly cost me the single biggest decision of this entire process. Backwards for almost 3 years. I still cringe a little saying that out loud. Here's exactly how backwards I had it. I thought Social Security was basically a formality, a fixed number that showed up whenever you decided to retire, and the sooner you claimed it, the sooner you'd start winning, the sooner you'd get your money back for all those decades of paying into it. I genuinely planned for years to claim the very first month I was eligible. 62. Get it while you can, right? That was the whole strategy. If you'd asked me at 52 why, I would have said something like, why leave money on the table, and felt very confident saying it. I had no idea how much money I was actually about to leave on the table by thinking that way. Here's what I eventually learned, and it's the piece of this entire 8-year journey that changed my math more than almost anything else combined. Your Social Security benefit isn't fixed. It grows automatically guaranteed. For every single year you delay claiming it past your full retirement age, all the way up until you turn 70. We're talking roughly an 8% increase in your monthly benefit for every year you wait, on top of normal cost of living adjustments. Not 8% total, 8% a year. Compounding. Let that actually land. Waiting from 62 to 70 isn't a small delay. It can mean the difference between a monthly check and a monthly check worth dramatically more, in some cases close to double depending on your exact numbers, for the rest of your life, guaranteed, inflation adjusted, no market risk attached to it at all. No market risk. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, because after everything I've told you about sequence of returns and shrinking portfolios and market timing, here was one piece of the puzzle that didn't care what the market was doing. It was guaranteed growth, just for waiting. I felt something close to sick when I first understood this, because I had been telling people, co-workers, my own brother, to take it early, using exactly the logic that almost cost me the biggest decision I'll ever make about money. Now I have to be straight with you. Waiting until 70 isn't automatically right for everyone. If your health isn't good, if you genuinely need the income sooner, if you've got a shorter life expectancy in your family history, that math changes, sometimes significantly, and anyone who tells you always wait without knowing your situation isn't giving you advice, they're giving you a slogan. But for people in reasonably good health, with some flexibility in when they actually need the income to start, waiting even a few years past the earliest eligible age, instead of grabbing it the second it's available, can be worth tens of thousands of dollars over a typical retirement. Sometimes far more than that. I redid my entire plan around this. Instead of claiming at 62 like I'd assumed for years, I started building my plan around drawing down some of my own savings first, bridging those early years myself, so I could let that Social Security number keep climbing in the background, guaranteed, untouched by whatever the market decided to do. It felt strange at first, spending my own money before I had to, on purpose, so a government check would grow larger later. Everything about how I'd been taught to think about money told me that was backwards. It wasn't backwards. It was the smartest trade I made in this entire process. And I almost missed it entirely because I'd never once questioned the claim it early instinct everyone around me seemed to share without ever checking the actual numbers. And that decision, more than the catch-up contributions, more than the fee savings, more than anything else, is the one thing I'd go back and tell my 47-year-old self first, if I only had time to tell him one thing. I think part of why Claim It Early feels so intuitive is that it's the only version of this decision that feels like winning something in the moment. You apply, a check shows up. It feels like progress, like proof the system finally owes you something back after decades of paying into it. Waiting doesn't feel like anything. There's no monthly deposit to point to, no immediate reward for patience. It's a guaranteed future number instead of a present one, and our brains are just not built to weigh those two things fairly against each other. I had to force myself to think in terms of total lifetime income instead of how soon do I start getting paid. Once I ran the actual numbers, comparing a smaller check starting earlier against a meaningfully larger one starting later, factoring in that this larger check would be guaranteed for the rest of my life, protected from inflation, immune to whatever the market decided to do that particular year, the early claim instinct stopped making sense for my specific situation. Not because early claiming is always wrong. Because I finally checked, instead of assuming. Because there's one more piece connected to it. One I almost got wrong in the opposite direction. And it's the one that finally made the whole 8-year picture click into place. The piece that finally made the whole picture click. I almost got this one backwards in the exact opposite direction from Social Security, which still strikes me as almost funny looking back. With Social Security, my instinct was to grab the money too early. With this next piece, my instinct was the opposite, to leave money sitting exactly where it was for as long as possible, assuming that was automatically the safe move. It's not. Not always. And figuring out why took me longer than almost anything else in this whole 8-year stretch. Here's the setup. Once I decided to bridge those early years myself, spending down some of my own savings while I let Social Security grow in the background, I noticed something. For a handful of years right in there, my actual taxable income was going to be lower than it had been in decades. Lower than during my working years. Lower even than it would be later once Social Security and required withdrawals both kicked in at once. A window, a real specific temporary window where I'd be sitting in a lower tax bracket than I'd probably ever sit in again for the rest of my life. That window is exactly when it makes sense to convert some of your traditional retirement money, the kind that gets taxed later when you eventually withdraw it, into a Roth account, where it grows and comes out completely tax-free from that point forward. Here's why that timing actually matters so much. If I leave everything sitting in my traditional accounts, eventually the IRS requires me to start pulling it out, whether I need the money that year or not. And by the time that happens, I'll likely be stacking those required withdrawals right on top of Social Security income, pushing myself into a higher tax bracket than I'm sitting in during these bridge years, sometimes a meaningfully higher one. So converting some of it now, during the low-income window, while I'm in a lower bracket, means I pay tax on that money once, at a lower rate, instead of later, at a higher one. And everything that money earns after the conversion, every dollar of growth, comes out completely untouched by taxes for the rest of my life. I didn't figure this out on my own, and I want to be honest about that. This is exactly the kind of thing where I'd tell you to actually sit down with a tax professional before you touch a single account, because getting the amount wrong, converting too much in 1 year, can shove you into a higher bracket anyway and defeat the entire point. This isn't a convert everything at once move. It's a careful year-by-year, bracket-by-bracket decision. But understanding that the window even existed, that there was a specific stretch of years where the math flipped in my favor if I acted on purpose instead of just leaving everything alone out of habit. That was the piece that finally connected every other decision I'd made. The catch-up contributions built the pile. The low fees kept more of it. The sequence of returns thinking protected the timing. The Social Security delay grew the guaranteed floor underneath everything. And the Roth conversion window made sure the government took the smallest possible bite out of all of it. 8 years, 4 dominoes. One number that used to say $7,200 that I still don't love talking about. And a plan now that I actually trust, not because I got lucky, but because I finally went looking for the parts nobody was going to hand me. You asked me, some of you in the comments on other videos, what I'd tell myself if I could go back to that kitchen table at 47, staring at that number with no idea what was coming. There's one more wrinkle to the conversion window worth mentioning, because it's the kind of thing that trips people up if they only hear the headline version. It's not just income tax you're managing during those bridge years. Certain other costs, like what you pay for Medicare later on, are also tied to your income from a couple of years earlier. Convert too aggressively in a single year, push your income up too high, and you can accidentally trigger higher costs down the line that have nothing to do with the tax bracket itself. It's another reason this isn't a go big move. It's a go carefully on purpose with actual numbers move, ideally with someone qualified looking over your shoulder. I say all of this not to overwhelm you, but because I think the honest version of I figured it out isn't a straight line. It's 4 separate corrections made at 4 separate moments, each one only possible because I'd finally started paying attention after years of not paying attention at all. Nobody handed me a master plan in one sitting. I built it one domino at a time, usually a year or two after I probably should have. That's actually the most useful thing I can tell you about this entire process. It doesn't require getting everything right immediately. It requires staying in the game long enough to catch each piece as it becomes relevant to you, the catch-up contributions when you turn 50, the fee audit whenever you finally sit down and look, the buffer thinking as your actual retirement date gets close, the Social Security decision in the years right before you're eligible, the conversion window in the specific years your income dips. You asked me, some of you, in the comments on other videos, what I'd tell myself if I could go back to that kitchen table at 47 staring at that number with no idea what was coming. I'm about to tell you exactly that. All of it, compressed into the next few minutes, the way I wish someone had compressed it for me. Here it is. 8 years, compressed the way I wish someone had compressed it for me at 47, sitting alone with a number that felt like a verdict instead of a starting point. If you're behind, really behind the way I was, the first thing isn't a strategy, it's stopping. Stop the panic moves before they cost you money you don't have room to lose. Crypto because a coworker won't stop talking about it. Day trading because it feels like action. A course that promises a system instead of teaching you to think. None of that is a plan. It's fear wearing a plan's clothes. I lost $4,200 finding that out. You don't have to. Once you've stopped bleeding, go find the correction Congress built specifically for people your age. Catch-up contributions starting at 50. Thousands more allowed into your 401k every year on top of the normal limit, just for having lived long enough to need it. Nobody's going to call you and tell you it exists. You have to go get it, then look, actually look, at what you're paying to hold your own money. 1% in fees sounds like nothing. Over decades, it can quietly cost you tens of thousands of dollars that should have been yours. One afternoon of checking is worth more than almost anything else you'll do this year. Stop thinking of your retirement date as a birthday you circled decades ago. It's not 65 because your father retired at 65. It's a range shaped by what the market happens to be doing when you get close, protected by a buffer you build on purpose instead of hoping you get lucky with timing. Question the instinct to claim Social Security the moment you're eligible. That instinct feels like winning. It usually isn't. A guaranteed 8% a year compounding just for waiting. That's not something the market offers you anywhere else. And it's sitting there, available, if your health and your situation allow you to use those bridge years wisely. And in those bridge years, while your income is lower than it's ever going to be again, look at the conversion window. Move some of what you can, carefully, at the right pace, into money that will never be taxed again. Get someone qualified to help you get the amount right. This isn't a move you rush. That's it. That's the whole 8 years. 5 corrections made late, made imperfectly, made one at a time by a guy who had no idea what he was doing when he started and still doesn't have all of it figured out now. I told you about Howard earlier. The guy who kept saying fine instead of checking. I ran into him a few months ago, actually. Not at work anymore. We've both moved on since then, but we still get lunch every couple of months. He's turning 55 this year, same as me. He pulled out his phone unprompted, showed me his contribution numbers, his fund fees, his own version of the spreadsheet I'd shown him years ago in that break room. He wasn't performing confidence from me. He'd actually built it. Slowly, the unglamorous way. The only way it actually happens. I thought about that break room conversation the whole drive home. How close he'd come to just staying fine, comfortable enough with a word to never check what was underneath it. How close I'd come honestly to doing the exact same thing with a different word. I don't think either of us was lazy. I think we were both just never given a reason to look, until we were. That's really the only difference between the version of me at 47 and the version of me sitting here now. Not intelligence, not luck. Just the decision, made late but made anyway, to stop assuming and start checking. I still don't have the number I need, not yet. The math says I'm going to be okay, but going to be isn't already there. And I want to be honest with you about that instead of pretending this ends with some finished, tied-up bow. What I have instead is something I didn't have at 47, staring at $7,200 and 22 years of work that somehow hadn't added up to enough. I have a plan I actually understand. I have 4 corrections working quietly in the background while I sleep, while I work, while I live an ordinary Tuesday that doesn't feel like a countdown anymore. I was you 8 years ago. I mean that literally, not as a slogan. Same panic, same 11 p.m. searching. Same feeling that everyone else somehow got the memo you never received. You didn't miss it, it's just late. There's a difference, and the difference is everything. I share this kind of thing every week, the real numbers, the mistakes included, not just the parts that make me look smart. If any of this helped, that's genuinely why I make these. And if you're wondering what happens after you've got the 4 corrections in place, how to actually build the month-to-month income plan that carries you through the first years of retirement itself, that's exactly what I'm walking through next. Started late, figured it out anyway. I'll see you in the next one.